Hello, listeners. This is Kat. Welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfic. This will be the continuation of Fall Apart, Collect the Pieces. This will be Part 19, Chapters 31 and 32. Chapter 31. Morning, Kachan, Izuku mumbled, dragging himself into the kitchen. He blinked at Katsuki's bare back sleepily, slowly processing his bare torso clad only in an apron. It was quite a sight, a symphony of shifting muscle and faded scars. Nerd, Katsuki replied without turning around. Coffee's in the pot. Thanks, he said, already gravitating toward the caffeine. He and Katsuki had been living together for 6 months, and they fit together like puzzle pieces. His divorce had felt like that moment when you're running, and you stumble, sure that you're going to hit the ground and wondering if you'll hit too hard to get back up. Moving in with Katsuki felt like catching himself before the impact, and living with him felt like finding his stride again. Now he'd hit the runner's high, and every day it felt like he was flying. Maybe it was because he was surrounded by love and support, starting and ending with Kachan. "What are you making?" he asked, peering around Katsuki's shoulder after he poured himself a mug. "Food," Katsuki grunted. "Make yourself useful and get the plates out, loser." Izuku smiled, fond and drowsy, and did what he was told. "We have to be in early today," Izuku reminded him, voice still rough with sleep. It was the only reason he'd woken up, the ungodly number of meetings they had today. He really just wanted to sleep. Hitoshi and Eri had been over until the small hours of the morning. They had almost crashed in the upstairs guest rooms, but Eri had to be back on campus for classes, so Hitoshi had taken her home. That had been at around 1 in the morning, and Izuku was wiped. "I told you to kick them out early," Katsuki said, not turning to face him. That was true. Katsuki wasn't as stringent about his bedtime these days, but he was still, ineffably, responsible, going to bed with enough time to get his beauty rest. And holy hell, were his beauty rests effective. It was possible that living in close quarters with Kachan again had kicked up some old feelings. He couldn't really help feeling them either, between the constant care and support, and the heart-stopping awe he felt when Katsuki walked around without a shirt on. There was no way he wouldn't feel something. Well, he always kind of felt something. That hadn't changed. He'd always have a little crush on Kachan. It was just a bit more intense due to the constant contact. Besides, it wasn't like anything would ever come of it. He thought back to that day, almost a year ago, when Uraraka had ruined his sense of security and made him question whether or not he'd ever find a love that was good to him. On her way out, she suggested that Katsuki wanted him, which was quite frankly ridiculous. She'd been trying to control the situation, he knew that. She'd been laying groundwork so that any kindness Katsuki showed would seem like it had an ulterior motive. Thankfully, Izuku knew him better. Unfortunately, it also meant that he knew better than to hope that Kachan would ever want him. He didn't mind that, though. Katsuki was in his life more than ever, and it was the best Izuku had ever felt. The eye candy was just a fun bonus. "You seen this shit?" Katsuki asked, interrupting Izuku's questionable train of thought. The blonde slid his phone to Izuku before forking eggs onto the plates, followed by toast and roasted veggies. Izuku's stomach gurgled at the sight of it, but he picked up Katsuki's phone, eyes scanning the article it was open to. Ah. Ingenium found not guilty. License still suspended. He wasn't sure if he had enough coffee to get into this right now, but he settled in anyway, picking up his plate and migrating to the table before scrolling through the article with narrowed eyes. Uraraka had been found guilty of many different charges. As it turned out, the reason she'd declined Izuku's settlement was because she didn't have the funds to pay it outright, and she figured that through the courts she'd had at least a 50-50 chance of being acquitted. It hadn't worked out in her favor, especially due to all the other infractions she'd been found guilty of and the amount of reparations she had to pay. She'd be serving jail time, too. It would be in a cushy prison meant for white-collar criminals and rogue heroes, somewhere away from the general prison population so that she couldn't face retaliation for the hero work she'd done. It was still prison, though. Ida's case was different. He actually hadn't intended to press charges against him at all. That had been Mina's doing. She understood why Izuku hadn't done it, but once his text transcripts had been shown in court, she'd gone on a warpath, demanding culpability. By that point, his license had already been suspended due to his role in improperly disposing of classified information. She hadn't thought it was enough, so she'd pursued her own damages for both herself and Eiichiro. A handful of other heroes had followed suit. It had been ugly. He hoped she'd be okay, given the verdict. "We should have them over for dinner tonight," Izuku said, "to keep their mind off the verdict." "I don't know if she'll be that pissed about it," Katsuki replied. "I think she mostly wanted to send a message to the shithead that his shitty, skewed moral high horse isn't shit. I mean, you see how they're painting him?" Izuku nodded. Where Ida wanted to represent a strong moral authority, someone to be looked up to, who represented a pillar of integrity, he'd been inadvertently painted as a weak-minded man, so blinded by love that he'd hurt the people around him in his mission to get into her good graces. People didn't blame him, but they didn't respect him either. They pitied him, and that had to feel like a cheese grater, scraping away at his ego. Public perception piggybacked off of my case, Izuku murmured, still scrolling. We leaned pretty hard into the idea that Uraraka manipulated our friends and doubled down on that with Ida. I know it's not our case, but... You wanted him to be found guilty. Kachan finished for him. Sometimes Izuku thought the man knew him too well. Hey, I get it. The sanctimonious jackass will find a way to twist it. He screwed his face up in an exaggerated imitation of Ida's stern scowl. I was found innocent because I can do no wrong. I swallowed a rule book as a child, and I shit gold bricks of justice, he declared, pitching his voice low and robotic to mock their former class president. Izuku chuckled, not bothering to hide his amusement. He'd done a lot of healing over the past few months, and he didn't feel bad about laughing at any of this anymore. Sure, there was still that edge of hurt when he remembered where he'd started, but he wasn't responsible for how other people behaved. Uraraka and Ida had made their choices, and they'd chosen to cause harm for their own gain. He was allowed to feel vindicated, even amused, now that those choices had backfired, even if it wasn't exactly noble to think that way. Yeah, well, Izuku shrugged, sliding Katsuki's phone back to him. He can say whatever he wants, doesn't change the truth, though, and the commission won't reinstate him just because he was found not guilty. He seriously fucked up, even if he was manipulated into it. Thankfully, Ida 10 hadn't been disbanded completely until the youngest Ida was reinstated, since he had agreed to step up and take the reins of Team Ida 10, especially since the staff was smaller and more manageable. And if Ida wasn't reinstated after a year, Tensei had requested that Smashbang transition Ida 10's sidekicks into their agency over an 18-month period. This way the sidekicks affected by Ida's crappy decision-making wouldn't be completely shafted by the dissolution of his agency. They'd been working hard to support him as he transitioned back into leadership. He might not owe Ida anything, but that didn't mean he wanted the sidekicks and staff to suffer, nor did he want Tensei to buckle under the strain. Besides, Katsuki liked Tensei. That was an honor bestowed on very few people, so Izuku felt a duty to protect him. Katsuki got up, sauntering into the kitchen and shuffling back out with the coffee pot in hand. Izuku pushed his mug forward, smiling gratefully as the blonde refilled it for him. We should just keep the stupid machine on the table, he groused. You drink so much coffee, it's a goddamn waste of time to walk back and forth for more. Izuku held back his fond smile. He didn't have to refill Izuku's mug, but he'd done it anyway, despite how annoying he found the task. Thank you, Kachan, he said, hiding his smile behind the rim of his cup. You're the best. Damn right I am, dork, he huffed. Hurry up and eat. You're the one who was bitching about being early. I wasn't bitching, I was just letting you know, he protested. Their morning routines were just another way that they fit together, another example of how closely they were partnered. Where one stopped, the other started, and they were never in each other's way. While Izuku showered, Katsuki washed and put away the dishes. While Katsuki showered, Izuku packed their lunches and poured coffee into travel mugs. While Izuku got dressed, Katsuki brushed his teeth and vice versa. While Katsuki put his shoes on, Izuku would grab their jackets. While Izuku put his shoes on, Katsuki would grab the keys. Take your scarf. It's cold as shit, Katsuki grumbled as he stepped out the door. Izuku grabbed his scarf and Katsuki's too, passing it to his partner before shutting the door behind them. It was a dance, simple and balanced. They barely had to think as they moved, in sync without trying. Then again, they'd always filled each other's empty spaces. A few months into living with Katsuki, Izuku realized that he finally felt at home in his own life. It was a feeling he'd been chasing his whole life, and it had snuck up on him once he found it. They walked into their agency side by side, chatting about Eiichiro's return to active duty and how he was planning to postpone it. His wedding to Mina was in 2 months, and they wanted to have a long, adventurous honeymoon. He was fully healed, and he'd almost certainly be cleared within the week, but the behemoth redhead wanted, and deserved, a break that wasn't forced on him due to injury. Besides, with the extra downtime, Mina could rest assured that their wedding planning could be carried off with Eiichiro keeping an eye on it. She was a shoo-in for the top 10 this year, so she'd been pulling extra patrols wherever she could, rallying by keeping herself in the public eye. While she was on her honeymoon, she'd undoubtedly lose some ground, so she was pretty fixed on boosting herself as much as possible before the wedding. In Izuku's opinion, she didn't have much to worry about. A month after the trial started, her merchandising team had created a Pinky-branded toy, the Slapper. They were an age-old amusement, a stretchy, sticky hand-shaped toy in Mina's color. meant to poke fun at the acidic slap she'd landed on her Araka. They'd sold out of her pre-ordered stock within 2 days. "I still don't think the idiot should take that much time off duty," Katsuki said, holding both their coffee mugs while Izuku collected their memos from his assistant. "I get wanting to take it easy, but the fucker's gonna get out of practice. It would be shitty if he went back on patrol in 3 months just to get deleted by some D-lister villain as soon as he stepped back on the street." "Morbid, Kachan," Izuku scolded. "He wouldn't let himself get that out of practice. He's still training, right? It just won't be as intensive. Besides, it's nice that he's supporting Mina like this. He knows she's trying to stay spotlight right now, so she doesn't have that much time for anything else." "That doesn't mean he shouldn't do some work, goddamn." "He wants some time to just relax. Are you saying that if I decided to take a sabbatical, you wouldn't pick up the slack? Partners cover each other's bases, Kachan." The tips of Katsuki's ears had gone pink, likely from the cold. Maybe this year Izuku could convince him to wear earmuffs. Kachan hated the cold, and it wasn't like earmuffs would impede his hearing, at least not if Hatsume designed him. He'd find a way to bring it up without scratching Katsuki's stubborn pride later. Leafing through the memos, Izuku sighed. It would be a long, packed day filled with the boring part of hero work, the nitty-gritty stuff that he wished he could hand off to someone else. "Can you let Hana know that we're going to need the new sidekicks in today's meeting?" he asked his assistant with a smile too tired for this early in the day. "Of course, sir," he replied. "Anything else?" "Yeah, we also need the team members who worked on last year's agency promo book," he said, already moving toward their office with Katsuki in tow. "That should be Takeda, Nakamura, and Ayasaki." "Got it," he called. "And for fuck's sake, make sure Deku remembers to eat his lunch before his 1 o'clock, Katsuki barked before kicking the door shut behind them. "Don't think I didn't notice that you didn't eat your lunch yesterday, you absolute twat waffle," he sneered, pushing past Izuku to put his coffee on his desk. "And don't think I won't literally call in to dispatch to make sure you ate it. You're a fucking disaster, Deku." Izuku's answering smile was warm and amused. "Thank you for taking care of me, Kachan. I promise I'll remember to eat lunch." "Yeah, right," he scoffed. "I'll remind you after our 10 a.m. "If you must," Izuku said, rolling his eyes. His heart felt warm under his care, though, even if it did come in the form of persistent nagging. He hoped he never stopped feeling as loved as he did in this moment. Chapter 32. Katsuki did remind him, after their 10 a.m., aggressively positioning his bento on its desk so that he wouldn't be able to miss it. Then he'd gone on patrol, leaving Izuku with the remaining meetings. Alas, that had been their agreement early. That Izuku would handle most of the interpersonal matters, and Katsuki would be in charge of filling out incident reports. Today was almost entirely interpersonal. Today, he would be conducting the first 6-month performance reviews for the sidekicks who had come from Team Itaten. He'd be going over highlights and room for improvement with them, as well as talking to them about career goals and giving them actionable steps on how to achieve them. Apparently at Itaten, that wasn't done, at least not since Tensei had stepped down. Under the younger Ida, if something went wrong, you got written up on a 3-strikes protocol. But you didn't get a chance to meet with leadership to go over strengths and wins. Under Tenya, discovering and building your strengths was your own responsibility, not something for management to acknowledge. When he'd found out, he'd been perplexed. Ida had taken the same agency management course as him in their 3rd year. Had he just arbitrarily decided that performance review and mentoring wasn't a worthwhile endeavor? Ridiculous, and frankly, disappointing. He was going through his notes, copying the major points into the official review paperwork, when someone knocked on his office door. "Come in," he called, glancing at the clock. He had half an hour before he had any meetings. He was pleasantly surprised when the door cracked open and Momo peeked around the corner. "I hope I'm not interrupting. Your assistant mentioned that you were slammed today, but he said you had a few minutes of free time right now." "I do," he smiled. She let herself in, shutting the door behind her. She was dressed casually and was carrying a paper bag. "It's good to see you." "You too," she smiled. "Sorry I haven't been around much. You know how it is." "I do," he replied. She pulled out a chair and sat across from him, placing the bag on the desk and sliding it toward him. "What's this?" "For you," she said cryptically, smile widening. Eyebrows raised, he opened the bag. Part of him knew what it was already. His friends had been going above and beyond, after all. His stomach swooped, and carefully, he lifted out a mercifully well-preserved All-Might plush. He recognized it as soon as he saw it. It wasn't mint condition. He hadn't known what that meant when he had gotten it. There was a pop seam on the shoulder from where he and Kachan had fought over it. His vision blurred with tears. Auntie Mitsuki had given it to him for his 6th birthday. He'd slept with it until he was 11. It hadn't been on display in his merch room. It wasn't high value, but was worth the world in sentiment. He'd kept it in his room, in his nightstand. He'd been sure he'd never see those items again. With no serial numbers and no intrinsic value, he'd been sure that it was destined for a donation bin. "It was," Momo said, snapping him out of his trance. She was smiling widely. "I've been spending my downtime looking through the thrift stores near my agency, and I managed to track that one down. I know it's not one of the high-value ones, but it's even better," Izuku replied earnestly, tears spilling down his cheeks. He clutched it to his chest. I thought—" He broke off with a pathetic sniffle. He ran his finger over a snag in the material that had happened when he and Kachan had been playing, the hair spikes on Kachan's action figure catching on one of the plush mite threads. "Thank you so much, Momo." "Of course," she replied, smiling. There was still something in her eyes that he couldn't discern. It felt like she knew something that he didn't. He didn't linger on it for long, lovingly inspecting familiar worn fabric, where only 6 months ago he'd been sure that his collection would be gone forever and his career would never recover. Now his agency was flourishing and growing, and his friends had tracked down almost half of his collection in their free time. Even Sue, who didn't understand his collecting at all, had tracked down the pin set that he'd been about to complete before shit had hit the fan. It wasn't complete, it probably never would be, but so many people cared about him so much, and they were striving to stitch the pieces of his heart back together. He didn't expect it of them. In fact, knowing how much time it must have taken to track down each piece, he almost wished they wouldn't. On the other hand, it made him feel so loved. "I'm going to head out," Momo said, standing. "I have patrol soon." He looked up at her, pouting. "Are you sure?" "I am," she replied. "You're busy today, remember? I'll see you soon, though, I'm sure." Carefully he set the plush down on his desk, away from anything that could snag or stain it. Then he stood, skirting the desk to hug his friend. "Come to dinner later this week? You still haven't seen the new place." She smiled. "Sounds perfect," she replied, pulling back to make her exit. "Oh, and I ran into Katsuki earlier," she said, pausing at the door. "He said, 'Tell that shit nerd to eat his goddamn lunch.' I would highly advise you do so in order to avoid his wrath, especially now that you live with him. It seemed like a sticking point." "He did threaten me a few times, so thanks for the reminder," he chuckled. With a little wave, she disappeared around the doorframe, the latch clicking quietly in her wake. Tears pricked at his eyes in the silence left behind, overwhelmed with the knowledge that he had friends that cared so much about him. Instead of sleeping in for an extra hour, Momo Yayorozu went out of her way before her patrol to bring him a fragment of his heart in a paper bag. He had no idea what he'd done to deserve friends like these, but he was so glad he had them. He sat back down, turning on his laptop and opening the spreadsheet. He marked the plush as found, made a note to send Momo a thank-you gift. Then, because he knew Katan would slaughter him if he didn't, he cracked the lid of his bento, snapped a photo and sent it to his explosive partner, then started to eat. His phone chimed a few minutes later. "Good nerd. By the way, Hag wants to know if they can come over for dinner. Also, I have some errands to run after patrol, so I'll meet you at home." He sulked as he put his phone away. On the one hand, it was nice to hear Katan call their place home. On the other, he'd been hoping to spar with them before going back. It had become sort of a ritual. On days where their duties were separated, especially if one of them was on desk duty, they'd make up the extra time by beating the shit out of each other. You know, bonding. There was another knock on the door, signaling the start of his second block of meetings. He looked mournfully at his half-eaten bento. Well, what Katan didn't know wouldn't hurt him. Izuku let himself into their house, pushing the door open with his hip. His all-might plush was perched in the crook of one arm, the other arm laden with groceries. He'd agreed to have Auntie Mitsuki and Uncle Masaru over, so Katsuki had texted him a long-ass grocery list. As he sauntered toward the kitchen, he couldn't help the happiness that surged in him. He loved coming home nowadays. Even in only 6 months, it felt lived in and comfortable, and it felt like it was theirs. The couches in the living room were comfortable and just stylish enough to appease the entire bakudeku family, casual enough to lounge on without worrying that every stray movement would ruin the fabric, but nice enough that they weren't an eyesore. According to Kachan, the cross-section of that Venn diagram was tiny. Picking couches had been a near Herculean task. They hadn't fought about it or anything, but they had taken a long time going back and forth until they'd found a decent compromise. The rugs had taken even longer, not to mention the dinnerware and the dining room furniture. They'd done it together, though. They'd compromised with each other until they'd curated this perfect space that was a blend of both their styles and interests. One of the many reasons that living with Kachan was already miles better than his actual marriage had been. They'd built a home. There were posters on the walls along with family photos, all the things that made them happy on proud display. He didn't have to hide himself in his own home. He hadn't even noticed he'd been doing it before. Hadn't noticed that he had been hiding pieces of himself in cupboards and closets until he started living in a space where he could let himself loose. He perched the plush on the TV stand, smiling at it softly before taking the groceries to the kitchen. Kachan would be home soon, and the least Izuku could do was prep the ingredients since he was going to cook. Katsuki would be excited to see the plush, too. It was a shared memory, and he'd been pissed when he'd seen it on the spreadsheet and realized it was gone. He'd just finished chopping veggies when Katsuki got home, slamming the front door behind him. Izuku paused, deciding whether that was a normal slam or an angry slam. It had a little more vigor behind it than usual. "I'm home, shithead." "I heard you, Kachan," he replied. "Could be a burglar." Katsuki snickered, making his appearance after he'd taken off his shoes and jacket. Izuku raised an eyebrow. "A burglar wouldn't have made it to the door before being incapacitated," he drawled, before refocusing on the onion he was cutting. And that was the truth, too. Hatsume had upgraded his security. Anyone with unfamiliar biometrics would be trapped in a gel-like substance that hardened on contact with biological material, then tased if they attempted to escape. She'd been inspired by electric fly traps. Katsuki joined him in the kitchen, plucking the knife out of his hands and hip-checking him out of the way. It was for the best. Kachan had faster knife skills. "Hey, look, your knife work's getting better. At least it's all in even pieces," he teased. Izuku kicked him in the ankle, pouting. "Mean," Izuku huffed. At least he knew the extra strength in the door slam wasn't negative. Kachan seemed to be in a pretty good mood. "You like me that way," Katsuki said, smirking. Yeah, he did. "No, I don't," he lied, turning his nose up. "I was going to offer to help, but now I'm not gonna." "Good, now nothing will end up burnt." Izuku scowled even as his heart clenched. He was so lucky. He got to spend every day with Kachan, and he was so happy even when Kachan was being a butthead. It felt like puzzle pieces locking in place. They fit each other's empty spaces, and Izuku wanted to live the rest of his life in the presence of Kachan's mean wit and playful banter. "The only time I burnt dinner in the last 6 months is when you accidentally blew up the sink and I had to help stop the bathroom from being flooded." He'd left the roasted carrots in the oven a touch too long as he tried to stop their house from turning into Atlantis. "You could have turned the fucking oven off, Deku." He laughed. His stomach twisted. The laugh was mean and mocking, but in that special way that let him know that Kachan was happy. God, they were both happy. It was such a relief. "You blew up the bathroom!" "Whatever, nerd. Make yourself useful and clean up before the old people get here, or I'll never hear the end of it from Ma." Izuku stared around the room, frowning. Kachan was such a neat freak that the place was always pristine. "What needs cleaning?" he asked sincerely. Katsuki rolled his eyes. "Just run a vacuum over the rug, straighten the couch cushions, set the table, put the shit on the side tables in neat stacks." No matter how many times Kachan's parents visited, Izuku never understood how nitpicky he would get before they arrived. He'd learned, though. He'd never needed things perfectly spick and span, but if it mattered to Kachan, he'd figure out how to cater to his dedication to neatness. He hoped so, at least. If it made Kachan feel as at home and comfortable as he did, it was worth the effort to learn. "Get the door," Katsuki called from the kitchen, still hard at work when his parents rang their biometric doorbell. Izuku complied easily, opening the door for Mitsuki and Masaru and getting strangled as thanks. Mitsuki threw her arms around Izuku's neck, squeezing him in what was meant to be a hug, but came off more like a python strangling its victim. "It's so good to see you, Izuku," she cooed, as Izuku's face slowly turned purple from lack of oxygen. "Katsuki is so greedy. He keeps you all to himself. You should visit us without him." "Sweetheart, you're strangling him," Masaru said, slipping his shoes off. She loosened her grip, but barely. "Why you wanted to live with that hellion I'll never know," she sighed. "Is he treating you well, Izu?" "Back the fuck off, hag," Katsuki bellowed from the kitchen. "You better be treating this precious boy well, brat," she screamed back. Finally she released him and let him lead them to the living room as he gasped for air. "He's treating me fine, Auntie," he wheezed. "Probably too well, considering how much trouble I give him." "He deserves it," she insisted. "Taking good care of you is payment for being a complete garbage goblin his entire life." He barked out a startled laugh, slapping a hand over his mouth a moment later so that Kachan wouldn't hear him laugh at Garbage Goblin. "This is why we don't invite you over," Katsuki groused, stomping out of the kitchen to give his parents a reluctant hug. "You love us, don't lie," Mitsuki snickered. "We keep you humble, brat." Izuku watched fondly as they bickered, Katsuki's parents making themselves at home. Their space was comfortable and welcoming, not just for them, but for their friends and family too. They blended in, without a second thought, and that made him unfathomably happy. His mother had always been on edge when he'd lived with Ochako. No matter how much he'd assured her, she could make herself comfortable. "Can I get you anything to drink?" he asked them. "Don't be ridiculous, kiddo. Katsuki can get it for us. You come catch up with us," she said, smiling soft and adoring. Katsuki scowled at her, but stomped away to get her a glass of white wine and a Sapporo for his dad. As annoyed as he pretended to be, Kachan couldn't hide how glad he was to have them there. He had made his mom's favorites for dinner, a Thai curry and some random side dishes. The evening was fun. Time spent with Kachan's parents was always fun. At this point, they were as much his family as Katsuki's, and he was glad to have them around more often. If he didn't think Kachan would explode, he'd have them over every week. "How has it been since you took on all those new sidekicks?" Mitsuki asked. After dinner, Katsuki had kicked them to the couches to chat while he tidied up. Izuku tried to help, and he'd gotten whipped in the face with a dish towel. "It's been challenging," he admitted. "Especially with managing more than one district, but we've been handling it okay. We've had a lot of support." "That's good," Masaru smiled. "We were worried that it might be too big of a workload for the two of you alone." "Tensei has been working with us as he reshapes Ida-ten," he explained. "And we've taken on a lot of Ida-ten's staff, too." "They're basically staying in the same fucking roles, just under our agency," Katsuki said, rejoining him. He flopped onto the seat next to Izuku, kicking his feet up on the coffee table and throwing his arm over the back of the sofa. "It's true. They already know everything about that area and how it needs to run," Izuku agreed. "We just need to administrate them." "And what about your collection?" Mitsuki asked. "Any luck?" "I've had a lot of friends and a handful of fans find and return some of it," Izuku said, smiling softly. "I've gotten about half of it back, which is more than I could have hoped for, honestly." "Well, I'm glad," Masaru said. "Half is a little surprising, though. I'd have thought Katsuki would have found most of it by himself now. It's all he ever does in his free time." Katsuki went stiff beside him, even as Mitsuki nodded. "He keeps having shit delivered to our place," she sighed, "checking over each thing to make sure it's actually yours." Izuku turned to stare at the side of Katsuki's face. Katsuki, for his part, stared straight ahead, poker face in place. Katsuki had maybe found 3 of his collection pieces and had returned them to him. Something was up. "Stop exaggerating, assholes," he huffed. Masaru raised his eyebrows and caught Mitsuki's eyes. Izuku watched their silent conversation, fascinated. "That's right," Masaru piped up with a nervous smile. "The security system, right, son? You didn't want to accept deliveries here because delivery people aren't authorized." "That carpet you have upstairs sat in our living room for 3 weeks," Mitsuki agreed. Unfortunately for both of them, Izuku had known them since he was 4. He knew when they were being evasive. More importantly, he knew when Kachan was being evasive. For starters, Katsuki, who had the shittiest poker face ever, would clench his jaw when he was under pressure. Usually he'd get away with it, because when he clenched his jaw, all Izuku could focus on was how razor-sharp his jawline was. Kachan was a work of art. It was a shame he didn't model more. But right now it was different. It wasn't vague evasiveness. It was situation-specific. Despite the burning curiosity, he smiled. "Probably for the best," he said. "The last thing I want is to be sued for electrocuting a delivery person." The tension cracked, both parents chuckling as Katsuki relaxed beside him. His jaw was still clenched, though. Curiosity burned him. Kachan was hiding something. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 32 of Fall Apart, Collect the Pieces. Chapter 33, the last and final chapter, will be up next. I hope you all are still enjoying it as always. Thank you so much for listening.